So I'm not an expert in procurement and government contracts, but what this Auditor General report describes with how the ArriveCAN vaccination quarantine app for travelers rolled out, it sounds like an absolute train wreck, a circus of train wrecks.
Overall, this audit shows a glaring disregard for basic management and contracting practices throughout ArriveCAN's development and implementation.
The Auditor General found no meaningful, coherent partnership between the agencies involved. No evidence that the agency in charge followed its own ethics code of conduct. Per diem rates, on average, for outside contract workers, more than $1,000 a day. And the paper trail was so thin, the Auditor General couldn't even say for sure how much the ArriveCAN app actually cost to make and maintain. And that's just what I learned by page 4. So let's go through it. So you remember peak pandemic when there were mandatory quarantines for people arriving in Canada?
Nobody wants to sit in the house all day for 14 days. Like, I got work, you know, I work, I got to be able to pay my bills and stuff.
But it was a lot to manage. The disease was spreading, border rules kept changing, and the government realized we need a better way to track all of this in real time. We need an app.
ArriveCAN is a user-friendly digital tool to help travelers comply with Canada's border measures quickly and securely.
The Canada Border Services Agency would take the lead, developing a smartphone app to track the different rules, give travelers information, and order quarantines when necessary. The app would initially cost about $80,000 to make, and eventually you could upload your vaccination status, use the app to fill out government forms. It was going to be great. Except it wasn't always.
The federal government told CBC News that due to a technical glitch with the ArriveCAN app, a small number of travelers received an erroneous notification instructing people to quarantine.
That small number turned out to be around 10,000 people. And let's talk about the cost of the app, because that's kind of the biggest deal here. The Auditor General's first big finding, in big, bold lettering, the precise cost of the ArriveCAN application could not be determined. We found that financial records were not well maintained, and we found that 18% of invoices submitted by contractors that we tested did not have sufficient supporting documentation to determine whether expenses related to ArriveCAN or another IT project. So, to translate, the bills that these contractors were sending the government, the AG says there was no way of knowing whether that work was for the ArriveCAN app or for some other project that had nothing to do at all with the ArriveCAN app.
We didn't find records to accurately show how much was spent on what, who did the work, or how and why contracting decisions were made.
This was the best estimate the Auditor General could give of where all the money went. Dozens of contractors, the other category alone includes 21 of them, they likely received around $60 million combined. The biggest recipient of government money, a business called GC Strategies, which brings us to the next big question. Who are they? As has been widely reported now, GC Strategies is basically two people running their consulting company out of a rural property in Woodlawn, Ontario. They figure out how to win government contracts and then
hired 6 other companies to build the app,
while taking a commission off the top, of course. And several times in the report, the Auditor General seems to ask the question, why them? Like, for example, GC Strategies won an early contract for a little over $2 million, but according to the AG, there was no proposal from them. Like, the government did have a proposal in hand, but it was from another company, not GC Strategies. There was no evidence pointing to any formal process to initially choose them for any sound documented reason. A few paragraphs later, a critique of government employees being invited by vendors to dinners and other activities. A couple sentences after that, we found no evidence that these employees informed their supervisors as required.
Normally when there's a contract that's issued, the public service would have a well-documented file to support the decisions that they've made. There is very little on file that explains why they were chosen, how they have the skills and competencies to deliver on the contract.
We don't know what the relationship was between GC Strategies and the government employees who brought them on board. That's not explicitly stated in the report. But the Auditor General says there was some kind of relationship, because in a new $25 million contract a couple of years later, still with the ArriveCAN app, she says GC Strategies was involved in helping the government develop the very criteria by which vendors could qualify to win the contract. And that those criteria were so narrow, extremely narrow, to use her words, that this likely wasn't the competitive process it should have been. Last month, CBSA President Aaron O'Gorman told a House of Commons committee of a pattern of persistent collaboration between certain officials and GC Strategies. They show efforts to circumvent or ignore established procurement processes and roles and responsibilities. The craziest example I could find was a case where companies bidding for the contract had to show that their subcontractors had experience designing, developing, and implementing mobile-based applications for two of the platforms below, iOS, Android, BlackBerry, which, seems like a reasonable requirement, right? But when GC Strategies drafted its bid, it listed one of its subcontractors as verbatim having experience designing, developing, and implementing mobile-based applications for two of the platforms below, iOS, Android, BlackBerry. Like, did they want the government to guess which two platforms their own subcontractor had experience in rather than just list them? Or, as one investigation suggested, was this literally copy-pasted and then stamped approved by government? The Auditor General found other problems too. She was critical of how reliant government was on outside expertise. It didn't have the skill internally to do the job, so instead paid per diem costs of almost $1,100 on average to external staff. And just so we're clear, these are daily costs that don't actually directly relate at all to the actual work being produced.
By my rough calculations, that's about 60% higher cost than if they had just done it in-house.
There was also an issue she raised about security protocols, that people being paid to effectively hack the app, to find weaknesses, test cybersecurity, that they didn't always have proper security clearance themselves, given how sensitive a lot of the personal information was being stored on the app. And just generally, she pointed out a real lack of governance on this file. Each agency believed its counterpart was responsible for establishing a governance structure. So public health and border services, despite both being heavily involved, just were not coordinating effectively. It wasn't until a full year after the app itself launched that there was a clear letter of intent signed between both agencies.
I don't think an emergency is a reason to forget some of the most basic things that should be done to show accountability to Canadians.
We take the obligation to manage taxpayers' money very seriously. Under no circumstances would we condone what the Auditor General determined to be contracting practices that did not follow the rules.
Since the start, the government's position has been clear.
I can assure you that the current contract for ArriveCAN was got at in a competitive process, and we're going to continue to be responsible in the way that we ensure the best possible protection for Canadians.
And they bristle a bit at the suggestion that the cost of this project ballooned all the way to $60 million from $80,000, which was what it was supposed to cost just to build the app. Because writing the code is just a tiny part of what this kind of project requires. And here's what I mean. The cost breakdown, as reported by Canada Border Services, $8.6 million for more than 70 updates as border measures changed, $7.9 million for data management, another $6.4 million for data and cloud storage, $6.1 million for call centers, $5.4 million for tech support. You get the idea. A lot of this has to do with running the app, not just creating it.
At the moment, there were allegations around cost overruns or inappropriate contracting practices. The Canadian Border Services Agency immediately began an internal audit and made the appropriate referrals to the appropriate authorities.
But the Auditor General says this was still a deeply flawed process from start to finish.
I've been an auditor for a few decades. I've been the Auditor General for almost 4 years now, and I would tell you that this is probably some of the worst financial record keeping that I've seen.
In her words, there was not due regard to value for money.